You wouldn't eat spaghetti if it was over 200 years old. So why are we still reading Jane Austen?
She's not spaghetti, man. So this is the History of Literature, Episode 1, Jane Austen.
I'm Scott.
I'm Nelle.
And we're Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot. And we talk about all sorts of bookish nonsense in a serious and silly way.
Make sure you like this video because it's going to be awesome, and hit subscribe so you can get more of our awesome content.
Do it.
Also, I want to say thanks to everyone who has given us support so far for watching and commenting and getting involved in the conversation. We think booktube is fun, and that's because you play with us.
It's all of you that make it fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just like self-flagellating in front of a camera. No, we're not doing that.
So this is going to be a series. What are we going to talk about?
Well, this is a chance for us to talk about. Do you know, when I very first started reading, I was like, all these modern books, they reference books that the author has already read, and then those books reference books that were before them, and so on and so forth. And I was like, so I clearly must start by reading the earliest classics so I can get all the
references as you go
all
forward.
The references as I go forward, right? Which is a bit of a silly way of doing it.
It's a weird science nerd approach, but yeah.
But I'm super interested in who influenced who and who came first, and I find that so fascinating because the time that somebody writes in is so important, and not just the time, but like, are they writing pre-Dickens? Are they writing post-Dickens? Like,
so you've waffled on for a bit, but what are we actually going to talk about? We're going to talk about the historical context of authors, I guess.
Yes.
And we're starting with Jane Austen, but in this episode we're also going to talk a little bit about
Sir Walter Scott.
And we do mention Fanny Burney a little bit. So that means that we're covering the time period of sort of the early 1800 1810s is where a lot of our focus is.
1810 to 1820 is where almost all of these books are released that we're talking about.
But we mention things all the way up to sort of 1890. I'm gonna pop a link for a playlist that's just going to be this video to start with, but as we make more history videos that will fill up, so that
sort of goes slowly
into
the next decade
and pick authors and all that, sort of argue about how we're going to do it. So that the link to that playlist is in the description. Also, I guess this is kind of relevant for Jane Austen July, so if you're participating in that, I hope that this gives you a bit of
relevance, bit of motivation, I don't know, whatever you need.
Jane Austen inspo.
It's topical.
Yeah. So the structure of the video is, first we're going to just do a quick timeline. Then we're going to talk about the context, the historical context that Jane was writing in and who was publishing at the time and who her contemporaries were and that sort of thing. And the response that she got at the time. Then we'll finish up with her lasting impacts on literature and publishing. So the timeline.
So we're starting in the 1800s, in the early 1800s. What's actually happening is that the middle classes and the lower classes are starting to get literate, and there's a demand for books. And as there's a demand for books, there's more authors. As there's more authors, the quality of the works are increasing because there's a larger pool to draw from. And of course, the number of available books and the number of published books are going up, and so on.
Yeah. And in sort of the 1810s, what the
big historical events, just to put this in context, the two names that you really will know about if you're alive in the 1810s is Beethoven, who was a piano playing Saint Bernard. That's a sort of an 80s joke, if you will.
Welcome to specific humour.
Yeah, like he was as popular as Michael J. Fox in the 80s, but... and the other name that you will know is Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon was like the French version of Donald Trump, but he was less tan despite spending considerably more time outside. He was short, he was fit, and he could ride a horse.
Right. It's also the time where the population hit 1 billion. So the world was getting big.
Now in 1811, the first novel that we will discuss briefly was released, and that's Sense and Sensibility.
In 1813, the first publication of Pride and Prejudice was published.
In 1814, there's a few books that we're going to discuss. There is Mansfield Park, there's Fanny Burnley's The Wanderer, and Sir Walter Scott released his debut novel, Waverley.
1815 saw the publication of Emma.
And then in 1817, sadly, that's it for Jane Austen. She's dead. Hodgkin's lymphoma got her.
Yeah, it's not a nice way to go. But after her death in the same year, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published.
Yeah. And that's also the same year that Rob Roy was published by Sir Walter Scott, his follow-up to Waverley. And then in 1820, he released Ivanhoe, his other famous works.
By the 1820s, Austen was out of print entirely.
In 1833, Richard Bentley's standard novel series picked it up for republication, and since then she's never been out of print, although she wasn't super popular in the 1830s.
But he published her in what we would consider, I guess, a box set, all of her 6 novels at once.
Yeah, so one tome.
A tome.
A tome, an Austen tome. And then, she's not super popular during the next 40 years, but then in 1869, her nephew released her memoirs, which was super popular, and then...
that publication included 2 of her unfinished works, so it introduced more of her work to
the second edition did, because the first edition was popular. The second edition, it includes Sandition and the Watsons. It also included that short novella she had, Lady Susan, and it includes some cut work from Persuasion.
Oh, awesome.
So lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And that sort of led to she was super popular because the memoir of Jane Austen was so popular. Suddenly Jane Austen was popular. And
not just with academics.
Yeah, previously she was considered as this sort of toffee high-end author, and they released really cheap versions of her work and illustrated versions of her work, and they were super popular too. And it was a bit of a surprise to the literary world because she was everywhere, and they didn't think that uneducated readers would be able to enjoy Jane Austen, but actually uneducated readers love Jane Austen, and educated readers love Jane Austen because she's layered her novels very well.
Yeah.
And I think the best way to sum up this rise in popularity is the 8th and the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. So the 8th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica listed her as an elegant novelist, and the 9th edition she was listed as one of the most distinguished novelists.
Yeah, that does seem like an upgrade.
So she's gone from an also brand to top of the pile.
So a bit of context for what was going on for her. I guess one of the major things that comes to mind is publishing at the time of Jane Austen was not exactly easy for women.
Well, women were expected to concentrate on motherhood and getting married, and Jane Austen wasn't doing either of those things, but she was discouraged from writing because she was concentrating on the wrong thing. And in order to publish Sense and Sensibility, Henry Austen, her brother, had to actually approve it with the publishing house. That was a legal requirement at the time.
Ew.
Yeah, and even then it was published anonymously. She released it as A Lady, and then her subsequent works were either published as the author of Sense and Sensibility or the author of Pride and Prejudice. So she was anonymous, and it was it was a nom de plume sort of situation. You knew who it was, but it still
decredits it.
It does.
Yeah, I don't like it. I guess the other thing that we've been talking about is that the dates. I think of Jane Austen as being a Victorian author, and she's not, because Queen Victoria was not crowned until...
No, Jane Austen is writing 25 years before Queen Victoria is crowned. Exactly. Like, I think Jane Austen died a year before Queen Victoria was even born, or Queen Victoria was one, or something. But like about the time that Queen Victoria is born, Jane Austen dies. So she's really not Victorian. But the thing is, at the time there was two big writing sort of styles or eras or whatever you want to call them, the Romance style and the Gothic style. And Jane Austen's not Gothic, and she's not Romance either. She's like something else.
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen, yeah, she's her own genre.
So we know that she was out of print by the 1820s. Does that mean she wasn't popular?
Well, she was popular enough to make a living with her works, but like she self-published all of her works except for Pride and Prejudice, and she made enough to support her family. She was making sort of £400 a novel, which was not quite enough for her to live a year on.
Yeah.
And like she lived a modest lifestyle, but she did have a servant to help her. So it's sort of, I mean, but realistically, if I didn't have running water and,
oh my God,
you know, like if you look at like all the problems they had,
especially with your terrible wife who doesn't do anything.
Yeah, you don't do any dishes or vacuuming or laundry.
No. We have a laundry lady.
Yeah, okay, I shouldn't pretend that I do the laundry.
You do not. So, to sort of do a comparison with a contemporary who was published at that same time, Sir Walter Scott published a book, his first book, Waverley, at the same time that Austen published Mansfield Park.
Well, to give you a comparison, it took Mansfield Park 7 years to get its first literary review, by which time Austen was dead. And Waverley was the smash hit of the day. It outsold all the other works. It was Sir Walter Scott's debut novel, and it just sort of threw him onto the scene. You know how sometimes a debut work from a new novelist today sort of suddenly that novelist is just everywhere.
And they've got chocolate penises or whatever.
Yes, the chocolate penis, which is a problem if they're a lady. That's...
I don't know if you're selling chocolate penises with your books.
It's an interesting addition. Messy.
Anyway, so what was Sir Walter Scott's shtick?
So Sir Walter Scott is actually a really important author, because what Sir Walter Scott did is he is the first author to write historical fiction where he treated the historical period as its own distinct culture. So, you know, because people's views and opinions change with time, and going back, and that's what he did. He was the first one to not basically go, we're the people of today, but we're actually talking about 200 years ago.
To give them a different perspective or whatever.
And he also hugely popularised historical fiction. And to sort of give you an idea, if you look like Waverley, Ivanhoe and Rob Roy, the first three big historical fictions, but if you look at the works that follow after Sir Walter Scott's work, he really paved the way for these novels. The Last of the Mohicans, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, Vanity Fair, The Scarlet Letter, A Tale of Two Cities, Romoda, War and Peace. There's some big novels in there, not just thick, because there's a lot of thick ones in there too, but well-known. But well-known novels, yeah. And would they have even existed without Walter Scott?
Well, we will never know the answer to that question, but he certainly seems to have changed the face of... historical fiction did exist, but he's changed how it worked. Yeah, look, historical fiction pre-Walter Scott existed. It was actually all four of the Chinese classics are historical fiction. Journey to the West, Dream of the Red Chamber, and the two others. Water Margins and Romance in the Three Kingdoms.
and the Tale of Genji, like it's super old. The Tale of Genji is like the first known novel, and it's a historical fiction, or can be seen as a historical fiction, because it's talking about 100 years prior. So, which is a long time ago, but when the novel is 800 years ago, it doesn't feel so long ago now.
Yeah. So Jane Austen sold sort of steadily, and he has sold like.
Yeah, like Walter Scott was hugely popular. He sold, but what's actually really interesting is that while Sir Walter Scott sold well, he sort of his popularity his popularity waned while Jane Austen's waxed and improved with time. As as a fine wine, Jane Austen has aged well, and Sir Walter Scott hasn't. And I think
He's more like cream.
Yeah, it's more like cream.
Don't leave him out too long.
Don't leave him out. I think if you compare Sir Walter Scott with the authors he paved the way for, I don't think it's any disrespectful to say that Tolstoy, Dumas, Dickens, Makepeace, Thackeray, George Eliot are all better than...
And did it better than him.
And did it better than him. Like, they're some of the biggest names in history, like... literature, rather.
So another contemporary is... Fanny
Burney.
Yeah, that's the one.
Fanny Burney's book The Wanderer was released the same year as Mansfield Park, and one of the things that people today really say about Jane Austen is that they like her because she's feminist, is that she has these strong female characters, and
which specifically at the time, like in comparison to the time when she was writing, is like super fancy.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, she's writing sort of 15 to 20 years after Mary Wollstonecraft released The Vindication of the Civil Rights of Women. But so both these writers probably have a bit of a debt to her. But Fanny Burney wrote this super feminist novel, The Wanderer, where a woman is forced to flee from Robespierre, flee France from Robespierre, and she leaves all of her money and ID behind. She doesn't have a name. We never learn whether she's English or French. We never learn whether she's high class or low class. Pardon me. We never learn anything about her. And she's forced to rely on charity and her own hard work, and this novel explores how she lives and gets by and the struggles she has, and Fanny Burney reduces her to just being a woman and points out how difficult it is to be a woman in today's society,
Well, that sounds really interesting, and it's probably now on my TBR, but I've never heard of The Wanderer before, whereas Jane Austen is sort of...
Yeah, she's not just prolific, isn't she?
Yeah, well, she's not just like fodder for BBC miniseries, but she's studied in high schools and universities, and she's definitely, I guess, a more household name.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I DNF'd The Wanderer, that's how much I thought of it. I DNF'd The Wanderer for this series, and the reason is her characters are so two-dimensional in comparison to Jane Austen. Jane Austen has these lovely, intricate, detailed characters with subtlety and depth, and like Elizabeth Bennet is fierce, for example, but she's not super fierce. She's strong and has a will of her own, but she can also be dominated. Like it's a subtlety, and that is a really low end example of it. But yeah. Fanny Burney doesn't have that subtlety in her writing. It is really two-dimensional and flat in comparison. And her writing's not quite as flowery and nice as Jane Austen as well. But
so it's a question of quality.
It's really quality. And look, Fanny Burney sold as well as Jane Austen in the time. She's a very well-respected author. People on watching this probably, there's probably quite a substantial number of people who have read her in the bookish community, but
I also think first round sales is a very poor judge of the quality of a book, because
Twilight. How are you getting?
Sorry,
but you need to get the name your name out there, and some people have better marketing and more money to spend on it, and
and even then,
and friends and influencers and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the next bit we're going to talk about is sort of her impact going forward. So once she has published her books and they've sort of had their resurgence, I guess, the mark that she's left on literature.
Well, she popularised, along with Goethe, she popularised something called free and direct speech.
Oh, I've got an example. Hang on.
So free and direct speech is a style of writing where the narrator can keep control of the characters while still portraying what they are saying and thinking.
So I've got an example just off Wikipedia. There are 3 styles, I guess, of direct, indirect, and free and direct speech. So direct speech, the example would read, he laid down his bundle and thought of his misfortune, and just what pleasure have I found since I came into this world, he asked. Indirect speech, which is also known as reported speech. So I guess this is how previously a narrator would refer to the subjects of narration speaking. He laid down his bundle and thought of his misfortune. He asked himself what pleasure he had found since he came into the world. But free indirect speech is he laid down his bundle and thought of his misfortune, and just what pleasure had he found since he came into this world.
So you see, he's portraying his thoughts in that, but he's not. There's actually no quotation marks in that either.
Yeah, and it goes from being sort of a summary of his ideas to being in the words of the character, even though it's not coming from the mouth of the character.
Yes. And this is actually really important with something we're going to discuss later, the unreliable narrator. But to sort of continue on with this before we go on with that, free and direct speech is actually something that is still around today, and there's a whole lot of authors that used it after Austen and Goethe popularized it. Most famously, Gustave Flaubert used it all the time, and he was very famous with it, but also Franz Kafka, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf. There's a lot of other people who use that all the time.
Yeah, it's actually quite common nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess that is one of the other things that she sort of expanded upon that existed was the unreliable narrator, as you mentioned.
Yeah, well, sort of pre-Austen there were unreliable narrators. It's been around for a long time. It was in the Canterbury Tales. It was in 1001 Arabian Nights. It was. It's probably most famous example at Austen's time was Cervantes' Don Quixote. But in Don Quixote thinks that a windmill is an invading army and charges it. Like, he's really unreliable. He doesn't know what's going on. He's crazy. He's a comedy character.
Yeah.
Right? And
his perspective is laughable. Extremely.
Yeah, he's unreliable for humour, right? Wherewith in Emma, for example, we've got a character in Emma Woodhouse. That's a character that you and I know. Like, we know people like Emma Woodhouse, and the views that she's portraying, you can still see what's going on, but she's not telling you the truth. She's telling you her version of the truth. So it's a textbook unreliable narrator, but it's not unreliable in the sledgehammer approach that Cervantes used.
But more of the subtle, and there's 4 versions of any story.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what Jane Austen has sort of done is she's, given you coloured glasses and is, showing you a TV show. You can still see what's happening, but you can also see Emma's bias in it. And that not only adds to the story, it adds to your knowledge of Emma as a character.
Gives it more depth.
It gives it so much more depth. She's able to build 3 or 4 things with one line then.
Yeah.
She's the amount of work she puts into her line, she gets so much more out of it because of her use of an unreliable narrator. And it's a really good example of her taking the tools that she has available to her that are already in use and utilising them in different ways. And like unreliable narrators are still utilised today.
It's one of my favourite techniques.
And like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Murderer of Roger Ackroyd, The Goldfinch, like there's just so many like and big novels that win prizes and get movies made out of them and critically acclaimed and all of that sort of stuff. Fight Club.
Yeah. I guess you can't really talk about Jane Austen's legacy without talking about satire and social commentary, because that was really her bread and butter.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody talks about her textbook or her classic wit and irony, don't they? And I think the best example of this is in Pride and Prejudice. The very start of Pride and Prejudice is a great example of it. A single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. But, like, Austen's really quick to explain that the Bennet sisters' house has been willed to their cousin and that they are in want of a house. And that the men in the novel, they have everything they want. They never want for anything. So she set you up with a lie there, you know.
A lie or a joke?
Well, what's the difference? You know. But yeah, she has, I mean, that's a really ironic statement. And it's right at the front of the novel, right? Like, that's added readability, like rereadability, I mean, to her work, because you read that and you're like, well, okay, whatever, what's going on now? And then you read the novel and you see what's going on, and then you reread it and you're like, oh, I only get that on the second, because it's in the wrong place for me to get that.
Yeah.
But she's done that deliberately.
So I guess, how is she received today, and how has her legacy lasted, other than sort of like looking at how many people study her in school and BBC miniseries?
So like which authors liked her for, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, so in her time, Sir Walter Scott was the biggest fan of her when he said, I've read Pride and Prejudice 3 times and it's a fine novel. And there are many other examples. George Lewes, who was the lover of George Eliot and friend with George Lewes, who was the lover of George Eliot and friends with Charlotte Bronte, is a really good example of that. Also, Ian Forster loved Jane Austen, and just today I read I read an article where 125 authors, modern authors, voted on the best author of all time, and then they did some points ranking system or whatever. But Austen made the top 10. I think she was 7th on that list from memory. I mean, it might have been 6 or 8 or something like that. So she's super popular with authors, but on the flip side, Charlotte Bronte didn't really like her, and D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf didn't really like her, and Mark Twain is even quoted as saying, every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig up her body and beat her over her skull with her own shin bone. It's a bit of a hard punishment for reading. I mean, every time he reads it, like he knows what he's getting himself in for. He's a bit of a masochist.
I think even if you want to beat her with her own shin bone, you can't really argue that she's irrelevant. I think that she's made her mark.
And I think the most famous example of somebody picking on her and throwing shade at her is essentially Charlotte Bronte. But Charlotte Bronte is talking to George Lewes, the famous critic and George Eliot's partner. And they're actually, if you look at what's happening in these letters between the two of them, they're having a discussion about Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott. And Charlotte Bronte is saying, I really like Sir Walter Scott, Jane Austen doesn't compare. And George Lewes is saying, I think you should reread her. You maybe will appreciate her more the next time, sort of thing. And then Charlotte Bronte is saying, I reread her, you're wrong. But but it is in comparison to her favourite.
Yeah,
Like,
it's not actually just straight out her saying Jane Austen is not my cup of tea.
yeah, that's it. It's just like saying, I know you think chocolate mousse is good, but have you had apple crumble?
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's
in the context of a debate.
that's it. And if you read those letters in full, Charlotte Bronte has both compliments and insults for Jane Austen, which sort of sums up how she was thought of in the 1840s and 50s, where she was not preferred to the darlings of the age like George Eliot and Charles Dickens, but since then she's definitely grown in popularity, and because she's so accessible to beginner readers, and that she still has something to offer for the scholars. Really, that's really clever layering. That the best authors that do that today are rare. Like Margaret Atwood and Donna Tartt do it, but I can't think of too many others. Maybe Sarah Waters.
I think it's everyone's goal, and
yeah, it's
shattering a few egos now.
Oh well,
they're all amazing.
I'm picking names off the top of my head, but
yeah,
like that is something that I think is the hardest thing for authors to do now, to write.
Certainly well, yeah.
Certainly well, and Jane Austen has actually done that, written to all different levels of reading, and
even to a modern audience that she had no way of preempting.
Yeah, like how do you do that? How do you write something that is still relevant 200 years
And just make sure women remain
later?
repressed.
But I think even if women weren't repressed, even if there was some sort of...
hopefully we get to evaluate it from that standpoint.
When women aren't repressed, you won't be listening to a man's opinion on Jane Austen.
So, speaking of, I'm going to pop some links in the description to some other videos about Jane Austen, because we've talked about her a bit here, but there's certainly loads more to learn. Cynthia has a video that I think is definitely a good starting point, but there'll be a few links. We publish videos every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday.
Like, subscribe, comment.
Yes, in the comments, tell us whether you like Jane Austen or not, and what your favourite Jane Austen is.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.